Hello, and welcome back to the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. This is Penny Sanseveri and Amy Cornell. And this podcast is about a topic that, once again, Amy and I have very strong feelings about. There was an article in Esquire magazine, and I want to say it was late May. And it talked about how unbelievably difficult it is to be a debut author without all the things. And I thought it was a little ridiculous. I really did, because I actually, ridiculous is maybe not a great word. I thought that it was, well, I guess maybe ridiculous. It just seemed like it was really out of touch. Would you agree?
Yeah, it was very, I feel like it was very unnecessarily scary in some ways. And I also feel like this industry is so complex. And I feel like doing these sort of lists is kind of really oversimplifying things in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I also felt like, I think 24 years ago when I was first in the industry, I think much of that was true. So part of me wants to write and leave a comment on the article and be like, hello, like, have you spent any time in the industry recently? Because anyways, we'll go through some of these points, but this is something that really makes me so mad, is that when people push outdated concepts and, sell them as new things, like the first point. So let's just take the first point, right? You need a book club in order to sell books, right? And that's obviously, I'm just going to say right now, that is fiction. That is big fiction, no pun intended. And I get this from authors. So what happens, and part of the reason why Amy and I get so fired up about this stuff and about articles like this in particular, is that, so an author reads this article and they think, oh my gosh, it must be really reputable, right? And I must need a book club. I must need all these things in order for my book to launch. And it's discouraging, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
really is. Yeah, because I can't tell you how many, we still get a lot of authors that like, I want Reese to promote my book.
Yes.
I want Jenna to promote my book. And if anybody here is going, who are those people? Good for you. You probably have realistic expectations. But truly, sorry, it's just exasperating to even try to put these kind of thoughts in the majority of authors' heads.
Well, and I want to be really clear, because it's not that we hate, like sometimes I know Amy and Penny sound like haters. We're not, like, we love Reese's. I love her book club picks. I read them, like I watch the book to movie thing, like I love them. But the idea here really is that you don't have to have, so your entire career isn't going to be ruined just because Reese won't respond to your hundreds of messages that you've sent on Instagram, right? And
Right.
that's kind of where we really get to. Would we love for a book club, or somebody to get, like Katie Couric, one of the authors that we work with, Katie Couric gave her a very unexpected nod. And the book, so she didn't even know. And all of a sudden this book starts selling like crazy. Like, we love that stuff. Those are great stories, but we don't, you don't necessarily, don't hold up your book launch waiting for that to happen. You want to keep going, because the majority of us aren't part of those 1%ers where that happens to. And sometimes, like the Katie Couric mentioned, sometimes that surprises us. Do you want to take number 2?
Yes. Okay. So number 2, I feel like these are closely tied together. You need a major bookstore push, marketing concept, marketing plan, distribution to sell books. This is also this blows my mind. Like,
I know it. I know.
Like, And we just did a show about Costco recently. Most of you probably caught it. If not, check it out. But how Costco is limiting its book sales to seasonal. I mean, that goes along with this a lot. I mean, the book buying market has changed so much that it's just like this one seemed so out of touch, you know?
Yeah.
Is the person that wrote this, are they, are they still around? Do they leave the house? Like, how are they buying books? Like, I want to know all the things. Like,
I know. I know it. I mean, it is, and again, this is an idea that really had merit 24 years ago, right? I mean, truly, like if you didn't have books, like if Barnes and Noble wasn't going to pick up, I told a insider publishing story a couple of podcasts ago that talked about, you know, a book that was actually killed by a publisher because the author was awful and was pulled out of major bookstores, which ended up killing the book deal. That just doesn't happen anymore,
sure.
you know? Um, the other point that the article made was that most books sell under 5,000 copies yearly. That does sit somewhere between fact and fiction. I mean, there's a caveat to this, right? So, the most books sell. I mean, a lot of authors would be thrilled with 5,000 copies book sales. Let's face
Sure.
it, right?
Yeah.
But the majority of books sell well the longer that you promote them, right? And I realize that in some cases that's not always possible. Maybe you've moved on to the next book or whatever. But so that's kind of true, but not really true because it's a very much a case by, like, you can't say most books, you can say some books. So I think you really have to be more specific. And the other piece of it though too is that Amazon, which obviously we've talked about this many times, is the majority bookseller in this country, doesn't release book sales. So how do we even know that that number is actually 5,000? Could be 10,000, could be 500. We don't really know because Amazon's not releasing those numbers. Now, and authors generally aren't just saying, well, I sold only 500 books this year. Like nobody's screaming that from the rooftops, even though, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know that that's necessarily a statement that anybody can really conclusively make. And maybe I'm wrong. And I hope that if somebody's listening to this, definitely point it out if I'm wrong and send us an email. But I think that's a really hard number to, like, hard and fast number to sit on. And nobody really wants to die on that hill, in my opinion.
Right. And to your point, Penny, I mean, speaking about individual books versus an author's actual income, like that's so different as well. You know?
Yeah.
So it's like, sure, most individual titles may sell under 5,000 copies a year, but that doesn't mean the author isn't selling copies through other titles. It's, again, this is one of those perfect examples of this industry is so much more complex than that. And honestly, if you try to Google, how many copies does the average book sell, you're going to get a different answer every time you search for it. And based on which article you click, because they're all using different guesstimates to come to some sort of number.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's a scary one. It's just better to focus on doing the right things because we do so many shows on this, but if you're focused on a number, you're not focused on the right things. You're not focusing on the actions you need to be taking. Instead, you're just getting overwhelmed by this number in your head that you're not hitting, which is pointless.
Right.
Let's see. The next one. A book needs to do extremely well during a pre-order or it'll never really take off or be successful. I mean, and that's definitely fiction. I mean, well, one, think about how many books don't ever have a pre-order, Penny. I mean, this is one of those, like, there are plenty of books out there that do extremely well that never have a pre-order. So we're just going to pretend those don't exist to make this point in this article. Like, that's another one that doesn't make sense to me. And as we talk about all the time, and we've already mentioned on this episode, in this day and age, success for a book is typically cumulative. Very rarely does a book do really well right out of the gate and then falter. Like, it's much more common for a book to build up with a slow burn and then to hit its stride. And if the author's doing all the right things, then the author starts selling titles more consistently.
Yeah.
It's not very often that a book, I mean, how often do you hear that, Penny, where a book had an amazing pre-order and then nobody ever bought copies again?
Yeah, that is complete fiction. Like I've never heard of that, you know. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, having a great pre-order, especially if you know what you're doing, especially if you have a platform to support it. Again, these are a lot of other kind of side topics that we've covered on different episodes before. There's a lot that goes into having a successful pre-order in the first place. So I think this is also another kind of weird, scare tactic. Like, you have to do a pre-order or you'll never have a successful book. But it's like, well, that's a lot easier said than done. There's a lot that goes into planning for and executing a proper pre-order to actually make it worth your while.
well, but
So go ahead.
sorry, no. Go ahead. I talked over you. I didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to say, so the concept of just putting your book up for pre-order is also not going to get you where you want to be either.
Right, exactly. But the other piece of it though too is that I mean, there are a rare number of books that do extremely well in pre-order, right? Because we are impatient as a society, right? We want it now. Amazon has trained us to get it now if we want something, right? We don't have to wait. We don't have to go shopping around. We can get it. So there are certain authors, like if you have a favorite author and whatever, like Colleen Hoover or Lucy Foley or something like that, and those authors are probably getting pre-orders, but the majority of authors are not. Like, whenever I talk to an author and they say, I really want to sell a ton of books in the pre-order, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, especially if it's a first time debut, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I just don't see it happening. And you can run all of the ads in the world. It's not really a thing anymore. You know what I mean?
Yep.
That I think
Exactly.
With the way that I think that it once was. So the next point that the article made is that, and this one really actually kind of cracked me up. You need thousands of advanced reader copies to promote a book. So Amy, let me just, so we've been working together for a long time. Let me ask you this question. When was the last time? So we always ask authors to send us books so we can send them out to reviewers and yada, yada. When was the last time that you asked an author to send us 1,000 copies of their book?
Dear God, never would be
Right.
the answer.
I would have to, so, and let me just say this about that. If you did that, I would drive to your house with the books and leave them on your doorstep, because I would be, first off, I have no room for 1,000 books. So the point being is that this is another very, very antiquated conversation, because yes, years ago, and again, like, I don't know how long it has been since the author who wrote this piece was in the industry, but I will tell you that even when I was first in this industry, I don't know, thousands of advanced reader copies, sure, but some of this is just, I mean, honestly, if you're mailing, and I read another article actually on Substack about this, which was written by a one-time in-house publicist, and talked about how, a lot of these media people that you're mailing books to are working from home. So they're not even getting their mail at that New York address or whatever address that it is for the magazine, whatever. They're working from home. So a lot of these advanced reader copies that you're mailing out get lost in the mail. They get lost in general. They never get seen. They never get read. You know what I mean? So it's kind of, first off, I think it's a waste of time. And when an author says to me, should I send, look, I've had authors that will ask me, should I send you a couple of hundred advanced review copies? And I'm like, not if you want me to keep speaking to you, because I don't know what I would do with all those books, right?
Oh.
But I mean, it's not a complete way. I mean, there was a great line in a movie, and it was the remake from Sabrina, where she says, sometimes more is not better, sometimes it's just more. And in the case of advanced reader copies, I think sending out thousands of copies sounds really enticing, like, oh, I'm going to get so many reviews. But then the flip side of this is that you get really discouraged, where now you've mailed all these review copies out and, 5 people have gotten back to you. And that's, you know what I mean? Um,
Right. Oh God. Yeah. No, I'm just thinking about, some of our clients they get their hopes up, and I mean, 20 is a big number for us just because we try to be realistic about how much the author should actually have on hand. I mean, we are also very much, as we talk about all the time, like you need to focus on your long-term success as well. Each phase is finite, and you have to be prepared to move on to the next phase and maximize on each phase of your individual titles, but also your author brand. So the idea of having hundreds of arcs on hand as if that is your only focus, that just doesn't make sense.
yeah.
Have a really smart, well-researched list of key players, key individuals, key outlets that you really think makes sense for your book. I mean, I can get behind that, Penny, but the idea of ordering a ton of books and kind of assuming this is just a numbers game is really not how this works.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the other piece of this too is that, we, part of the reason why our book request number is so low is because a lot of these people just prefer digital arcs.
Right.
A lot of them would really rather have, something that they can just read on a tablet too. So,
Yeah, absolutely. We get that question a lot during campaigns. Like, how many should I expect to, how many requests should I expect to have for print versus digital? And it's like, candid, we can't even begin to guess that
no.
because it's really a personal preference. Just like all of you listening right now probably gravitate to a certain format when you read, whether it's print, digital, audio, you know what I mean? And I'm sure most of you kind of stay in that lane, except for a few exceptions. And reviewers are the same way. Outlets are the same way. Those individuals have their preferences and they generally stick to it.
Yeah, exactly. So point number 6.
Authors need to be influencers. Oy.
That's painful.
It is. This one, that is, and I'm with a lot of our clients when they say like, I don't feel like I have anything to say. Granted, I think that that's a very healthy way to look at it. But not to knock the power of a great social media account, especially depending on what genre you write in. We're not going to go into all of that. Like, it has a time and place, but the idea that an author needs to be an influencer on social media in order to be successful just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, nowadays, being an actual influencer, as ridiculous as some of them seem in terms of like, how the hell did they get to be an influencer? They put in a lot of time. It may be stupid stuff that they're talking about. The videos may be ridiculous. You may not get it or understand what they're saying half the time, but that is a job. Nobody spends 20 minutes a day on social media and becomes an influencer. That is a total myth. And again, it doesn't matter how stupid the content is or how ridiculous you think it is. They are still spending hours, like full-time job hours a week to maintain that influencer status. So the idea that an author, one, has the time and or inclination to want to do that just kind of leaves me with a big, question mark above my head.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that we always joke that I'm a Costco influencer, and I'm really not, because you see some of these people who are active on Instagram, and I know TikTok scares you, Amy, but a lot of authors, a lot of authors climbed onto the TikTok train trying to be influencers and then realize that you're competing with all of the other voices screaming about something similar, and finding something unique to say about a topic. And then posting so constantly, and when you could be promoting your book and writing and all this other stuff. I just don't know. I think in some cases it happens organically. Like, we've worked with authors where it happens somewhat organically for them.
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know that it necessarily needs to be your go-to goal. I mean, I certainly, I mean, y'all can do whatever, obviously, but because I talk to authors sometimes and they'll say to me, like, I listened to your podcast, so I know how you feel about this. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're really a little bit forceful with our opinion, but it just doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it's not a good use of an author's time in our opinion.
Right, definitely. And I think Penny, I mean, despite the fact that we kind of ragged on pretty much every point that this article made, I think
We're so mean.
I know, right? But I think the point behind this piece, you know what I mean, what kind of motivated it was to reiterate that, this is competitive. Like the market is very saturated. This statistic just blows my mind. There's a book published every 8 seconds
So
in this
crazy.
country. And if we were keeping better track of time, we should have had that ready to go to say, like, okay, this number of titles have published since we started talking on this episode.
Yeah.
But truly, and what works against, and we talked about this on a recent episode as well. The idea of books being an impulse purchase it's not how people buy books anymore. It's not the vibe for books. It's not how people engage with reading and with authors and with books. Because as a general rule, with how fast paced everything is, everything news is here and gone within an hour, and we've moved on to the next thing. So scarcity and timeliness are really just taking over what is put in front of us nowadays. And a book published every 8 seconds does not align with that. There's no scarcity in publishing. There are more books around than we could ever, even the biggest genre fan could ever read in a lifetime,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so as authors, we're trying to compete with that and trying to get their attention, which can seem like an uphill battle a lot of the time. But what we try to talk about a lot on this show is being strategic and being smart about it and not spinning your wheels. And we really try to focus on putting who your reader is, really having an understanding of who they are, what makes them tick, how they engage with books. All those kind of things are going to serve you so much better than trying to grasp onto these broad, unreachable concepts that we've covered, that this article covered, that we've been talking about.
Well, and I think that one of the biggest challenges, that authors face among the, many of them that we talk about on this podcast, is the fact that the majority of authors don't really know who their reader is, right? And I think this is particularly true for debut fiction. So you get, or any debut nonfiction, it doesn't really matter. You get this book done and you're like, well, I think my readers are these people and these people and these people and these people. It's like, well, they're probably not all of those people. So I think that zeroing in on, and we say this all the time too, we have a reader profile and we're actually redoing it. So we'll put that up when it's redone, when Penny has the time to redo it, because there have been a lot of things vying for both of our attention recently. But spending some time profiling your reader, not just to figure out where your book belongs on Amazon, but also, how to create enticing book descriptions and things like that. I mean, this isn't, there isn't any kind of a magic formula, but there is a formula that's going to get you nowhere. And that's not knowing who your market is, which I think is, which is something that, as we've talked about before, that a lot of authors face. Authors tend to overestimate who their readership is going to be.
Right.
And I get it. Like, you fall in love with your book, you're just like, everybody's going to love this book. Well, that's actually not really true. Right. And I think the final point that's worth mentioning it is that we want you to, be invested in your own success, meaning that you are actively engaged in doing promotion, and maybe you're working with us or you're working with somebody else. Hopefully you're not working with somebody else. Hopefully you're working with us, but don't put it on the line for your first book, meaning that again, this is not about just be a slacker and sit on the couch and wait for the royalty checks to come in. You have to be strategic. But I talked to an author recently, and this author is actually quitting their job to focus on their first book, which honestly, even saying it, like, I feel like I'm just going to start shaking. Like, just that kind of terrifies me. And I don't know what this author's financial situation was, like, whatever, but they told me on the call that they hoped that there would be a revenue match within 30 days of their book launching, meaning that their book would be making as much as they just gave up with whatever their job was. And honestly, again, the pit of my stomach, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel unwell.
I know, I just grabbed my trash can.
And, it's the kind of thing that creates bitter diatribes and authors who just end up giving up, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, we worked with an author several years back, and he was awesome. Like, we all loved working with him, and we really wanted to keep working with him. But he kind of, for a weird, random reason, kind of gave up. And I think he had a lot of other stuff probably going on. But anyway, a weird coincidence, like, I have a neighbor who knows him, really good friends with him and family and everything. And she ran into him in the store and asked about his book, because we had gotten to talk. He was like, oh, you know this guy? Yeah, we marketed his book, etc. And he told her, he said, I will never again. That was a shit ton of work. And he was really not, like, he wasn't upset with us, but he was just like, it was the amount of work for him, I guess, he felt was just over the top. And it is a lot of work, which is why you really have to pace yourself, right? I mean, you take it seriously. Obviously, you're listening to this podcast, but don't quit your job. Don't get discouraged if in the first week of you've only sold 5 copies, and don't be discouraged if Netflix doesn't write you or is chasing you down for the TV rights of your book. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think are really good to have on your long-term goal list, but to expect those and to be completely discouraged when they don't happen is kind of building your success on it's a little bit like a house of cards, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that just to kind of wrap this up, I mean, I think that, there's a lot of fallacy out there, Amy. I mean, we address a lot of this on the podcast, but man, part of the reason why we wanted to do a show on this is both because we hope that this was helpful. I know sometimes we sound a little bit like a broken record. It's like, oh, do the work, pace yourself, blah, blah, blah. Like, I get it. But the amount of false information that's out there just blows my mind.
Right.
It's
very true. Yep, exactly. And the idea that there's one roadmap that works for everybody. That's also not true,
Yeah. So no, I'm glad
everybody listening could follow these ridiculous tips that we talked about and still get very different results.
Yeah.
That's just how it's always going to be. So there's not a single roadmap or a single, if you do all these things, that's how you're going to get a bestseller. That's just not the reality of how this works. There's so many different factors. And I will say, shameless plug, that is something that we always try to help authors kind of weed out and figure out for themselves when they work with us too, is kind of developing a path that works for them and for their brand and for what they're willing to put in. You know what I mean? Taking all those factors into consideration.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, I think giving them the tools and hopefully the motivation to keep going, because the successful author is often the one who just doesn't give up, right? So we hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. I realize that this was another Amy and Penny Have Strong Feelings podcast, but we hope that it was helpful, and we love your show ideas, by the way. We would love a review, and please share this show with somebody that you feel could benefit from it. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.